Great, you guys hear me? Our first speaker tonight is Brian O'Neill from Rhythm Spice. Very glad to have him here. Let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, well, thanks for coming out, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about design thinking today and design. So there's going to be kind of two halves to this, and I'm going to try to rush through this pretty quickly. The first half's going to be more conceptual, and the second half I'm going to try to give you guys a bunch of stuff that maybe you can walk out with and apply today, because I know people like kind of tactical, hands-on things they can do. So real quickly, my background, I have two lives. I'm a professional musician, and I'm also a professional designer, a product designer and user experience consultant in town. I used to work full-time jobs at a lot of big Lycos and Fidelity and JP Morgan, and done a lot of startups, and I'm involved with a couple startups now and some freelance music projects as well. Those are some of the places I've been, so maybe I know some of you from those days. So the good news is that all of you guys are already designers, and you probably didn't know it. And how is that possible? Well, if you're doing anything that people are using, you're making choices. So that's kind of the first thing to know, is that there's no non-choice. So every choice is a choice, and design is really about a collection of all these tiny details and decisions that we make all day. So hopefully we can make you better today. So what's good design? These are some of my favorite examples up here. So the first one is the paper towel dispenser. So we all go into the bathroom, and someone innovated and made the little machine that rolls the paper towel thing out. But my favorite one is the one that always has a towel hanging down, because you don't have to touch anything and you don't have to interact at all. So when we talk about interaction design and these things, interaction isn't necessarily good. So if you can avoid interaction, that's actually even better. So that's actually my favorite paper towel dispenser. So next time you go into the bathroom, you can think, how many things did I have to touch and get my hand? I just washed my hands, and now I'm going to go touch this nasty thing. And little fun trivia fact, the dirtiest thing in the bathroom is actually the air dryers. It's not the hand ones, because they blow all the germs around. So that's my little trivia fact for today. The second one is the ATM in the middle there. So how many people have noticed how some ATMs you pull the card out in order to get your cash, and other ones they give you the cash and then you say, I'm done with my transaction. So some people finally thought about this and realized we can prevent people from leaving their card in the machine by making them have to get their card out first to retrieve the cash. So again, small detail, and not the kind of thing that you might see in a requirements document, or you're told to build something. This is why it's important to think about usage context when you're developing things. So there's no requirement, it still works, right? You can get your money out after or before the card, but when we can prevent errors and prevent failures in services, we want to do that. We don't want to error message and nag them with questions. We want to try to prevent interactions if we can. Third one, Apple is actually not the greatest software company, so before you go and copy their interfaces, they're very good at hardware and product design. Software is kind of a little bit iffy. However, Time Machine, I thought, was one of the really great things that they came up with. And why? It has an on and an off button. I don't have to set policies. I don't have to try to remember which files to back up. It just backs up everything, and it kind of seems to know about how often to back it up. And all I know is that I've never had a problem where, oh my God, I didn't have a copy of this thing that I needed. It kind of just works. Is it perfect? It's not perfect. But one of the good things about this is they made good assumptions, and they thought about what assumptions can we make in the design that are probably right for a lot of our users. And so that's another thing that you guys can take away is make good assumptions. Don't necessarily assume that tons of choice is always the best way to proceed. We're not going to give you anything. We'll just give you all the tools so that you can do whatever you want. But now you just put all the work back on me. It's like it's our job and your job, if you're not working with the designer, to figure out what the best initial default state is. And the last one here is bank software. So we're going to talk a little about thinking temporally, but I don't know if you've ever added a payee. So what do I want to do? The user goal is I want to pay my mom, Rhonda O'Neill, a check for something. So I go in and I go to add account, and I type in mom's information, I hit save, and then it goes away. What's wrong with that? I didn't want to create an account. I wanted to send my mom a payment. So what should it do? It should focus me on the box and say, would you like to pay your mom? Yes, of course I would. So thinking temporally about these things, little changes like that. I was so happy when my bill payer came out with that, and finally the next thing after you add the payee was they immediately dropped you in the payment box there. So these are little examples of good design. So what's the secret here? Take a look at this quote. Maybe you guys have heard this before. It's your job to find the problems and to solve them. So I write code too. I was a generalist designer, developer, and I've really focused on design in my career, but I believe it's important to understand the materials that we design with. And what I've noticed and when I've thought about this presentation is that when you build stuff, it's very, there's a draw to build. You're engineers and you want to create and you want to write code and you don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff because you like to build. And I kind of know what that draw is like too. But really, the more you can understand the problems that you need to solve, the better you're going to be at solving them, instead of kind of taking guesses and then kind of playing the whole, well, wait, we'll get feedback, we'll just launch the first version and get feedback on it. It's the classic one. No one really gets a lot of feedback, or they're getting feedback the wrong way. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The design thinking thing has a couple different definitions, but it's kind of a combination of empathy, which is understanding the people that are going to use your service. What are their pains and problems and challenges? Creativity, which is the creation part, which is probably where we spend most of our time. And the rationality, which is often kind of overlooked, but this is like, we're a business, we need to make money, or we're a nonprofit, or we have these goals that we need to do. Successful products bring all three of these things together. So if you're working at a commercial place, you probably need to help your company make money, but users may want to do this other thing that doesn't necessarily go along with that, and we want to create some really creative solutions for those things. So design thinking was a way to kind of bring these three things together. And one of the key things, probably the most important thing that I can talk to you about today is this: the need to rebalance. And by the way, everything I'm telling you today comes from my experience consulting largely with companies that don't have designers. They know they have a problem, and so they bring me in, and I end up working largely with product managers and software engineers a lot. And so part of my thing is like, I want to help them, teach to fish, right? Not just come in and provide design, but kind of change the way people approach these things, especially so you can recognize good design and you can recognize problems. Talking to the people that use your services and discovering the problem, what I call the discovery phase. There's a lot of different words for this, and ideation or whatever, but really understanding like what the big challenges are is really going to change your perspective on what you're building. It's going to answer questions. You're going to think about these real people when you are developing, and 6 months later and you're working on something, you're going to think about John, the guy that uses your widget to count trees, and how like what he really cares about is, you know, like, I don't care how many trees per square foot, I really care about like how close is the nearest city. And so, you know, whatever it may be, you're going to remember these conversations that you had, and you're going to remember their struggles if you watch them use your product, and you're going to incorporate that learning. And you're going to question when someone says, let's add this feature that does X, and you're going to say, John doesn't want that. And I talked to John, and I know John, and we have an ongoing dialogue, and you start to turn this elastic persona, as we call it, the guy that we kind of make up this user who kind of can bend to want any of the features that we've come up with. We kind of make him more real. So that brings me to this. I really like this quote. We probably all know 37 Signals. They made Basecamp and Backpack. And I think this is a great thing. Start small and deliver some real value that you've thought through. Don't boil the ocean. So, is your app half-assed? Here's the signs of suckage. The elastic users. You have technology that you know it's good for something, but you haven't quite figured out what it is, but it's this cool thing. That's not necessarily bad, but you need to change your thinking and start to look for a problem for that. Adding more instead of improvement. I hear agile tossed around all the time. It means nothing these days, essentially, and most of the places I talk to are doing incremental development clouded under the term agile. They're just breaking off big projects and just lumping on. They're not doing the iteration part of agile. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Especially for engineers, the design model doesn't reflect the real world, or it reflects the data model. That's another one I see as sites. It's a classic sign for me if I understand what the database model looks like and the objects in the system, and I see like one page for each of these objects on the screen, and there's a list view and a detail view and a whatever. It's usually a red flag that something's wrong, because most of the time the data model doesn't make sense. It's an abstraction of the way human beings think about stuff. We think about goals and tasks and activities. I need to change my address. I moved. I want to get online statements instead of whatever. We're not thinking about, okay, that's a user record and the School of Public Health has this system with users in it, and then like, no. It's like, I'm just Brian and Harvard should know who I am if I go to school there, right? So you're probably thinking, well, that's not my job and I'm not a designer. But you can be a design thinker. So I can't teach you all of how to be a great product designer today in 30 minutes, but I can try to hopefully show you different ways to think and approach these problems. And it's not art what we do. It's much closer to science, and there's a little bit of art and talent there, but read this quote from Tim Brown. I think a lot of people think that there's this genius designer. They think of Apple or they think of the iPod, and these things just leap into the minds of designers and they come up with these amazing things. There are occasions where that stuff happens, but a lot of places really rigorously apply some thinking to this process. It's not magic. The design is not a big black magic kind of thing. You can find processes to measure what you're doing and apply your learnings from that and improve. If you don't know IDEO, they're a product design consultancy. They do a lot of non-software products, and Tim Brown's the CEO. So start thinking like one of us today if you can. Some of the core things in the practice of doing design thinking are the part about talking to customers, observing people using your product if you can. This is a big one. If you have an opportunity to do this, like there's tons of guidelines on how to run like usability studies. Some of you have probably heard of these before. There's a scientific method involved in doing that. There's structure. The big one to do there is not to focus on what people say when you're observing them using your product. It's just to watch what they do. There's a big disconnect between what people say and what they do. That was really hard, or that was really easy, and they just spent 30 minutes trying to check out and buy a CD, but they love your site so much, they don't want to hurt your feelings, but you just watch them suffer. So it's just, you really have to kind of learn to really watch people's activities and not focus on what they say when you're doing observation. Sketching, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and aligning your ideas with your organization or your business. So whoever's paying your paycheck or the division you work in, or like what are their objectives and how does what you do align with those? That's part of building credibility, and it's keeping your product alive so that it has legs and it can grow and continue. So today, all of you can probably find 5 people to talk to either interview them and start to understand what they do on a regular basis, either about your product or just in general. Like someone said, I don't know, what's an example of one of the products I heard in here? There's a video, there's like, what do you tell me? You're the video, you do video.
Nope.
The analytics thing. So you could try to understand like, who are the consumer of your software? What are your problems, and how are we solving things for you, and how are we not solving things for you, and keep them talking, let them take tangents. Use that as kind of a phase to discover. It's not hard to do, because all you have to do is keep asking why. And I do this all the time with people. Don't ask yes and no questions, just keep asking why, because everything comes back to food eventually. I don't know if you know that whole thing. It all goes back to because you need money, and then so that you can eat, so that you can live. It all comes back to food in the end. But we call that laddering, and you go up this process, and eventually you kind of land on this nugget, which I would call kind of like a goal. And it's usually kind of intangible, but the light will usually go on there, and you'll kind of know like, oh, that's what people are doing, or that's why they're doing this. And now you can work your way down and get into the nitty-gritty design part about that. So from that, when you hear about activities they're doing with your product or in their real life, if you're modeling a real life thing and you're bringing it online or something like that for the first time, we want to model those activities. And by model, I really mean write them down. You probably know them as use cases. I usually call them user tasks and goals. And I mentioned stakeholders are people too. When I come into a company, usually I work with engineers to understand technical limitations and requirements. I talk to business stakeholders because I need to understand what's going to allow this thing to float. And then of course I talk to end users, and sometimes there's a real diametric opposition going on there. And in the best cases, they all line up. So you need to also talk to the stakeholders that you work for. One of the problems I see regularly with use cases or stories or whatever you want to call them is that people aren't thinking temporally. They're not oftentimes a use case, right? Like, I need to sign up for the thing, I need to register for DjangoBoston, I need to type my phone number in, and then I need to share this thing in order to get a free CD from Brian after the show, or whatever it is. Like, that's a use case. What often happens is no one's thinking about what was the context that guy was in before he went and did that task, and what might that person want to do after that task. So you have to remember that while there are some discrete points where you finish an activity, I'm always thinking about what's the next thing someone might want to do, so that we're not just developing these kind of like artificial chunks that are usually cut up because of technical requirements or scope or whatever it may be. At least know what comes before and after, so that you can say, yeah, we built this thing, but it's an island. No one can get to that because there's no form to get to it, so we just created an island. But at least now you know you created an island. So when someone says, we spent $2 million on that piece of shit and no one uses it, it's like, that's because no one can get to the thing. We need to build a bridge in the next sprint in order to get to the thing we just made. And you can start to bring this up. We didn't think temporally about the entire experience. We just cut up an arbitrary slice. So think temporally. Define success before you build, and then measure that later. What do I mean by that? Let's have a goal. We're doing a redesign or whatever it may be. Let's set some status. Pick a number out of the air. Pick something to get started. We want to see a 20% increase, or we're going to change this thing and we want to see 10 more people sign up per day, or whatever your metric is. Start with a baseline and then do some work on a project and go back and measure it so that you know whether or not you're having an effect in a quantitative way. You can get feedback talking to people, qualitative feedback, like, oh, I really love the service, I use it all the time, blah, blah, blah. You can get the quant side, which is the analytics and stats that we often talk about. But you want to try to measure what you're doing so you understand if you're having a positive effect. So a lot of times, again, I come in and it's like, is the design good or what's going on? It's like, well, tell me what good is. And you'd be surprised. Like, a lot of times people cannot actually define to me what success is. So I'm like, well, how good is the design? It's like, I don't know. Like, what do you want people to do with it? Like, let's have some boundaries here. It can't just be anything, or else it's just my opinion and people think that my opinion matters. And it's like, I can give you heuristic advice, like best practice advice, and lots of assumptions are built into that. But I don't know. So if you don't know, all right, well, let's stop and talk about what success is so that we can actually fairly measure what we're doing. Sketching. I know we all like to write, I don't really like to write code. I kind of hate it because I'm not good at it. But we can all sketch. And one of the things I see happen a lot is, it's especially now with all the open source code, and there's so much free widgets today, it's that there's a temptation to want to always build stuff and just try it out. So we're going to talk a little about that in a minute. Why is sketching good? Paper and pencils, whiteboards, my particular favorite, because I like to do this in teams, usually with product manager and engineer. Anybody can do this. It's not about being free. It's super fast to change your mind. Nobody gets offended if your thing isn't right. You don't have, this is my sketching. This is not pretty. This doesn't look nice. That's not the point. This is to get everybody on the same page together about what we think our problems are and what our solutions is. This is a sign-up wizard for a startup in town called Infinio. They do caching, data storage, offloading, stuff like that. So this is a sign-up wizard, and so we can work together through the stuff instead of writing a long requirements document that nobody wants to read, and then you build the whole thing, and they're like, that's not what I meant, and then you're like, I'm sure you've all been there a little bit before. So visual is a much better reference. You get rid of this thing like, that's not what I meant, which usually is because someone didn't write a detailed enough spec, but if they did, no one would want to read it because it'd be 200 pages long. Like defining the placement of all this stuff in English, it's like, no. Sketch it first, jam these ideas out, create as many as you can. Like, we can all participate in this. You do not need a lot of skill to sketch. And so this brings to the next thing, which is the pixels and the beauty and the graphic design and the visuals, which I imagine a lot of you are probably thinking about when you heard about design today. So I do want to give you some tips, and they're free. All right, so here's some tactical stuff. First one. Copy people's ideas and plugins carefully. What do I mean by this? I often see, like, we'll use this plugin to do this thing because someone already built it. Or look at the way Amazon did it, we'll copy that. Don't assume that someone spent time designing it right. just because they put it out there for someone else to use. A lot of times I look at this, it's great, everybody's using it, it doesn't make sense to me. The patterns are off or whatever it may be. I would consider what it looks like and how it works just as much as I would consider the code quality and is there people regularly checking in and working on this project. So copy carefully and think about, does this thing really work well? And like, if I use this plugin, is it going to be easy to make sure when I think temporally, like, am I creating a silo where it's like, well, we'll use this plugin to do this other service, but it needs its own user account. So they're going to have to create this account now, and you just created this morass of stuff also that you could have this cool island of technology that you needed for free. But if you're thinking temporally, you might start to realize, what are the trade-offs from a user experience standpoint doing that? The next one is your tutorial. It's what we call a crutch in the design world. Your little tour that you have in your 5-page thing. Why is that wrong? It's wrong because it's the right information at the wrong time. So I just logged in and you just told me I need to remember 5 pages of icons or graphics trying to communicate some abstract idea that I don't know, because I don't know all the things your product does. And I got to remember all these before I go do the thing I wanted to do. So do you really think I'm going to remember all of that stuff? It's kind of frustrating because then I'm like, I'm probably going to need to know this stuff, but I'm not going to have to know to get back to that tutorial at the time I need it. So you're actually just frustrating people. So the first thing is to fix the design. And if you really need tutorial or tour stuff, put it in context at the right time. Don't put it all in front and call it a tutorial and manage it as a help documentation. Not helpful most of the time. So it's generally a sign of a crutch, and try to avoid them if you can. Next one, this is a classic one for developers that I work with. Context over consistency. Everyone thinks consistency is really good. So here's my thing on this. Consistency is a very good starting point, but you need to know when to break the rule. So, oh, it's a date input, so we should use a date picker in a standard format and you drop it in there. Has anyone ever been to a site where you had to type your birth date in and they used a date picker? It's like, great, it starts at 2014. I was born in 77, so that's 37 clicks back that I have to go, and then I got to find the right month, all because it was consistent, and everywhere you go, you should be date pickers, right? No, it's like, I just created an arbitrary example. Let's go to dinner. Well, you probably want to go to dinner maybe tonight or tomorrow if you're booking your reservation. You know, I'm just making an assumption. Maybe OpenTable, most of their reservations are like that. If I found out most of their reservations were all piled up in the next 48 hours, give me a quick way to get right to that stuff and bury the features and other stuff later. So always break the rule if you know that the task will benefit from that. Don't worry about the consistency crutch. The next one, fix the product and not the training and help. We kind of talk about this in the middle. You all remember Clippy, probably from Office 95. Not only not helpful, but it was like annoying help. It couldn't get worse than that. It's not only helpful, and it's in your face, and it's bouncing. It was just absolutely terrible. And why did that come out? Because their product had become such a pile of poop for, like, do you remember when there was like 10 menu bars? There must have been like 500 icons on that thing because they hadn't really designed this thing properly, and at some point they actually pulled the plug and the new ribbon style Office thing came out, and all these people were up in arms because these corporations, all these millions of people in Office workspaces had learned all the side tricks and the shortcuts to work around all this stuff, and then they had to break it. I actually think that was the right thing. It's like, we got to cut our losses because we're just dragging this baggage along. We're creating talking paper clips. It's like, you know, you got a problem at that point. So next one, don't abstract your UI tech too early. So what do I mean by this? I need some widget that does X. And we're probably going to need this other one that's going to do something similar, but it's going to be 2 people instead of 1 person. And then there might be this third one there, but we're not sure it's going to be for guests. But anyhow, so this is a designer talking to you, and you're thinking, okay, so we need a user model, and we need a whatever thing. And so I'm going to create this method that's going to do this abstract, blah, blah, whatever. The problem with that is that most of the time what happens is you abstract this thing to the point where the primary need or use case has kind of, the quality has been lost from the experience because your widget now will do 1,000,000 things instead of just 2 things. So my rule is kind of like, let's wait till we have like 2, 3, 4 instances of something before we start to like abstract it or kind of force the designer. I'm kind of thinking now in the role as a front-end developer because I like to design in the pixels in the front end with data. don't force me into that stuff too early. Let's wait and get it right before we kind of like make the code perfect, because the time it might take you to rewrite it may not be that long. So you have to kind of make that trade-off between quality and great code. So we talked about this one a little bit easier. Does everybody know what a mental model is? So a mental model is the way people perceive your site to be. Like a great example of a mental model you all know is the subway maps. So you'll notice that all subway maps go up, down, or at 45 degree angles. You'll never actually see a subway map laid out the actual way it looks on a real map, because our model tends to be that directions are either perfectly up and down, right to left, or at an X. So you'll always see subway maps laid out, because that's our mental model of it. It's not actually real. So another example of this is, again, like if you work at a company that does acquisitions or a big college, there might be 50 applications that actually have a Brian O'Neill, like a user table in it that has my record in it. But for me, I'm just Brian O'Neill and I have an ID, and you should know where that. I don't know where your stuff is. I'm Brian O'Neill and you should know where I am. And if I move, I want to type my address in one time and give you my new address. I don't want to go to 50 places to do that. So that's my mental model, is that it's just me. Your model is, wow, we have 50 services to sync up and blah, 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 blah. So think about that. Data model not equal to mental model. And the way to keep doing that is to remember verbs, tasks, activities. You're thinking about people's needs. You're not thinking about objects and records and nouns. And this is it's a little bit abstract, but the more you're constantly remembering about tasks and goals and activities, the more you can make sure you're not going off the deep end, or you're going to lose people from an experience standpoint. Minimize registration questions. So sign-up forms, you should be giving value if you're going to ask for my email or my zip code or whatever it may be. It's okay to ask for it, but generally speaking, the less stuff you ask for, the more completions you're going to have. And there's also this concept of distributed registration. So let's say you really need people's gender, for example. You don't necessarily have to collect gender at sign-up. You can do, like you've seen the LinkedIn profile, your LinkedIn profile, 92%. And now they've actually kind of almost created like a game or a system that kind of makes you feel, 92, come on, I can get 8%. Like you kind of want to fill it out now. However you do that, whether you give value or you gamify it or whatever, unless you really need that data for some business reason, and it's usually a marketer wants the location data or whatever it may be, I'd really push back and try to minimize setup and registration, especially on mobile. Next one, Agile is not necessarily Agile. I think we ship a lot more code, but the spirit of Agile has largely been lost. So my thing is, if you work at a company with this stuff, I've seen every version of Agile, mostly Scrum these days. It doesn't matter what you call it, doesn't matter what the rules are. I don't believe in like these clinics where you get certified in Agile. Find a process that works for you, but remember the agility part. It's about fast, but it's also about iteration. It's about quality, shipping stuff sooner, less documentation, talking to people, having a real user involved with that stuff. That stuff matters, and that tends to get pushed off. It's really become more like, let's just do 2-week coding projects and ship them out the door and call it Agile. So there's more to the manifesto than just shipping code regularly. Mobile, I didn't have time to do some visual samples of this, but just some quick little tidbits. When you're filling out forms, try to avoid changing the input context. So what do I mean? There's a phone number dial thing, and then I hit next, and now I'm in a spinner. And then I go back to a full keyboard, and then I go to this other thing. If you can avoid this thing where the UI is bouncing around because it's pulling up the proper keyboard or input method, that's generally really good. And I've seen a really good example of someone doing this well is the Square card reader, the credit card reader. If you go to that, when you type the numbers in, all the numbers are in one row. You type the card number in, and then you type in the security code, and it's one input. There's no bouncing around. It just slides the cursor over, because we all have typed in those numbers 1,000,000 times, and we know how to type our birthday, and we know these things. So it's a great example of just a nice seamless experience. There's no bouncing UIs and the pages scrolling and all this kind of stuff. So next one is use big tap targets when you can. If you can remove some buttons or favor the popular choices in your app, that's good. And keep the tap targets big so it's fast. Another one is that I've seen sometimes is you didn't think about someone actually having their hand on the device, and so when they type something in or they did something, the feedback is appearing under their hands. So then you have this thing where it's like, oh, did it do anything? Like, you're not sure, and you're kind of getting that frustration because there's been no feedback, as we call it in the design world. So watch for where the feedback is going to land. Context, don't forget offline usage, don't forget about outside, don't forget about lighting. Think about these things in the mobile context because they may affect your design. And again, do a few things well, start small. Next one, someone said they were into data visualization. I like that kind of stuff. Here's my first rule of data visualization. These graphs are identical in terms of data density. They tell the same story. This one is about 8 times as big. So why should I fill up 20% of the screen with that chart? Well, because I can really see that there's actually a little dip right here. The chart is not to go figure out what was the precise value of X at this time. The chart is what is the trend over time of this thing. And if the spark line, these are sometimes called spark lines, these little small data graphics, can convey the same information, and this is especially true if you're doing like a dashboard or something that people look at regularly where they can start to know what the expected shape is, keep them small. Shrink your graphics. Most of the time, like at least half, most of the graphs I see could be shrunk in half and carry the same amount of data density in them. So shrink, shrink, shrink if you can. Next one. This is also from the client of mine, Infinio. So real quick so you can understand this thing. In order to offload storage, they have RAM, a RAM cache. So when requests come into a data center for read-heavy, like analytics where you're pulling data, they hold all this stuff in the cache and they can say, oh, you don't need to go to disk for that. We're going to serve it out of RAM, and it goes back. So that the effect of this is you're offloading IOPS from storage. So the product, the business wanted to show on the dashboard, well, we want to show people how much it's doing, like how good our product is, how much is it offloading. So they're like, oh, we can count the IOPS that were offloaded, right? 64,000 IOPS were offloaded from your storage. That's great. As compared to what? What does that mean? How many donuts is that? Like what? I need to feel what that is. And so I said, why don't we figure out how much a regular disk drive costs and how much it can do, and count it in disk drives. So now it's like, oh, I can get my head around that. That's like 2 shells of disk. That's $30,000 in NetApp storage. So we just save $30,000 a month with this product. Now, yeah, the engineer might say, well, it depends on if it's SSD or it's a SATA drive or blah, blah, blah. And you can put a calculator or whatever. It doesn't matter because it doesn't have to be exact. And the person that uses this is going to know, like, okay, well, how much did you charge for the drive? But they're also going to be like, oh, that's kind of cool. I can tell my boss that. And that's why this is actually in here. It's not so much that the operations guy in the data center might like that. It's more that he can give his boss something, ammunition to make a decision to say, you should buy this product. We save 21 disks. That's like half of the disk we have all now. It's like, because the CIO probably has no idea what a disk is. So he needs to relate that up in a way that can be understood. So the other thing with this, the previous slide here, as compared to what, a big flag for me is when someone says, oh, we want to have an analytic or something, like there are 123 widgets. The first thing I ask is, as compared to what? Like historical number of widgets that have changed, or the average widgets, or everyone else's widget count, or whatever it may be. Most of the time you need some extra data near that number so that 123 actually has some meaning. So otherwise, unless people really know what this stuff means, it's out of context. So you need to provide something, and asking the question as compared to what is kind of my like little rule of thumb when I see magic numbers, as I like to call them, on the screen. That's an Edward Tufte thing. Tufte is an author. He's a data visualization scientist at Yale. He's written great books. So I would definitely check him out if you're in the data viz space. Another tip. Compact and denoise your tables. So what do I mean by noise? This is also a Tufte-ism. What we call non-data ink and data ink. So do you see this blue shading here and the white stripes here and the negative space that's created next to the question mark and the word citrus? This area in here, all of this is non-data ink. That's designer talk for you. It's unnecessary ink on the screen that's not helping you do anything. It's not conveying any information. So one of the first things I do if I sit looking at lots of data tables or charts, charts is another one, like charts that have black, the amount or the temporal scale, everything's written in black. The first thing I go do is cut everything down in half opacity-wise to light gray. I almost go to invisible. And I take all the striping and all the crap out of there, and I start with nothing. Because you can actually, this is the same data, and what is that, a 30% reduction in the real estate? So we can increase the data density without confusing the design. And it's not to say that borders and shading are never needed, but a lot of times there's just way too much non-data ink on the page that's not necessary. So try to use the invisible grid lines that are here, that are naturally created by alignment. If you can try to go, do y'all know what I mean by grid? So a lot of times designers design on grids that are like 16 pixels this way and 16 this way, and they try to align everything on this imaginary grid that you don't usually see. You might see it in Photoshop when they're doing comps, and maybe you've seen a spec with redlining about all the spacing. That stuff matters, and it helps us not have to do all of this crazy striping and bordering and shading and gradients and all this crap. Because that might be fine for like a dash, like if this is the only statistic on the dashboard, but if you've got 50 of these, that's a lot of non-data ink. It's a lot of noise to sift through on the screen. So try to reduce that stuff. Next one, to clarify, you add data. So this information overload thing is kind of a farce. The problem is not information overload, it's undesigned information. Information you can't draw conclusions from. The stats aren't necessarily the bad stuff. So this is another storage product I worked on. You don't really need to understand everything that's going on here. But in short, the name of the thing is top 5 virtual machines that are in trouble right now. And so when I came in, it's like, what did I see? Data. The data model was the system. So I can click on a VM, and then I get CPU, memory, storage, network, and then I can look at the CPU thing. Oh, look at all the charts there. It doesn't tell me why Oracle Data Mart is like down right now and I'm getting 50,000 phone calls and like I'm going to lose my job. It did no analytics at all. It was just what we call a metrics toilet. It's just tons of numbers and charts with no conclusions. No one thought about how I might need to do that to do my job. And our job was help IT admins never have to get a phone call because everything just works magically and they're in the basement doing their thing. That's really what their whole job is about, is avoiding crazy stuff. So we're like, well, why don't we put the charts up about what's going on? The charts give us context, right? The first thing we heard was like, well, I want to know what happened. So like in the last, 2 days, 3 days, what was going on? But then the next thing was like, well, is that normal? Because some of our systems run backups at 2 in the morning. So the 6-week chart gave us context to say, that's abnormal. Like this event should not happen. Like we look at this curve, there's a pattern here over the 6 weeks. So now I know that the data is telling me that this is actually abnormal, it shouldn't be happening. And then we made the software go and figure out, well, what might be responsible for that? The OS is at 95 and it's paging or whatever it may be. The software drew those conclusions for us. So can they drill down and get more data? Yes, but that's all tool time. I don't want to spend my time looking at CPU and then look at the network and then try to remember how the shape went because I really needed the charts lined up on the timeline, but I didn't have the right stuff. That's all what we call tool time. I don't want to do tool time when I'm about to lose my job. I want to know what's wrong with it. I want to know, okay, we have an OS utilization, maybe a process is crazy. Now I don't have to do any drilling. I can go right to the guy that owns that Exchange server and tell him, something's going on with your CPU, can you please check out what's going on because you're totally screwing us, blah, 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 whatever it may be. So add data to clarify. Don't make me go drill in and do all that stuff. So getting to the end here, this is really true. Charles Eames was a furniture designer. You've probably sat in his chairs and seen them quite a bit. The details are the design. The sum of all of these little, like the non-data ink and the border striping and stuff I was talking about, it's not just that one table needs to be fixed. It's the sum of all of these little tiny nits. So if you've ever worked with a designer, like, could you move it up 4 pixels and could you like just change the shading? And you're like, I'm sure you've all been there. No one likes to do that stuff. But the reality is the sum of all of those tiny nits is what makes things magical and special. It's the products that I knew that that's so awesome. It knew that I was going to go here. It's like, it knows I'm home. And it's like, it says, are you home now? We'd like to turn the lights on for you. Because someone thought through that experience, a little tiny, yeah, you can always say I'm home and hit the button, but it's kind of nice that it asked me that question. So these details matter. So that's my quick thing. I hope I didn't go over. I don't know what the time was when we started, but if you have any questions, my email's up there. I'm on Twitter. I'm also a musician, so if you like music, you can check out my band, Mr. Ho's Orchestratica. Little plug there. And thanks to Nate and Max and John. And
so we are a little over, so we're going to move directly into.
All right, let's do it.
Into we will have plenty of time for questions and stuff at the end, but I want to make sure we get your stuff. So actually, maybe before setting up on the presentation, we can maybe do a question or two. So.
Yeah, there's just an on-off on there. I think it's really that.
Set.
Do you want to do questions while he's getting ready?
Yeah.
Sure. All right. So, your take on CAPTCHAs? You get the mic.
What's that?
CAPTCHAs.
I read an there was a great TED talk about the. Oh, you probably don't need that now. I probably do.
Yeah.
I don't.
Is this on? Hello. Okay. CAPTCHAs. I haven't had to deal with a capture in a while, so I don't really have an opinion on them. I know there's a lot of plugins for these. There was an interesting talk about how I guess they're trying to scan all the books, and they're taking, the captures you see are actually coming out of scanned pages from books that they want to digitally encode the real words in books. And so they actually you all are participating when you fill out captures and recording the books. That's my little trivia fact. If you're going to use a plugin, we didn't talk about accessibility, but that's one thing to keep in mind. People that have impairments, so visual impairments, we tend to think of blind people, but there's also partial vision loss. There's learning disabilities. There's people with motor impairments. There's a variety of different disabilities that we need to consider with that. So the blind one obviously being a good example. If you can't see, and they're intentionally making it hard to read this thing so you don't get spam, how do you get past one of these things? So that's why a lot of them have the little audio player on them now. That's for people that can't see. So I would minimally make sure that it's not too difficult to read and that there's an accessible option that goes with that if you're going to use one. So I generally would try not to have them. On my personal website, I just have 5 times 2. I always put a little math question. I've also seen one like, which one is not a dog? You know, so you can have fun with it too. It doesn't necessarily have to be some squiggly letters. So like I think game sites could maybe have a little fun time with it or something like that. We didn't really talk about fun, but that's another thing. Fun is okay. Fun is okay in business software. It's okay in consumer software. Don't underestimate the value of just of adding some pleasure to people's lives on a daily basis if there's a little place to do that. So, any other questions while he's getting set up? Yeah.
So. You're talking about observation. I was wondering if you had any tips about how to get more of it, or if you had
how to get more observation. Do you mean opportunities to do it?
Opportunities or tools or anything like that.
Yes. So recruiting tends to take time, but it's kind of an investment you can make up front. So finding people is one of the hardest things, and finding the right users. Sometimes you're really far from them. So I usually go to salespeople. If you're in a commercial place, the salespeople usually know that, and they will freak out the first time you want to do this because they are so careful about who gets to talk to the customer. But if you start doing it in the right way, they will find out that their customers love this stuff because it's like, here's an hour, this guy's not selling me anything, and all I get to do is tell him about my problems. It's like free psychology. So you'll actually usually find the users love it and the sale guys love it because his customer's happy. It's like, they come in and listen to me bitch about their product. It's great. So it takes time to build up that stable of users, but you can usually go back to keep going back to them. You want to have enough that you're not constantly talking to the same people at the same time. There is like usertesting.com. There's some online services for these, but I generally don't go for more. Go for a few and your personal engagement with that. It's really important to have that face-to-face if you can. I know sometimes they don't, not in the same state or whatever, but that personal interaction is actually, it's really powerful. It will really change your perspective. I've seen rooms of engineers watching someone use the thing they built and watching them either suffer through it or this is so freaking cool. And it really changes the engineer's perspective on stuff. And they'll also say you know what, I'm not gonna work on that because that thing works really well. We tested that last week. That guy loves that thing. And there's video to prove it. And you can start to not just be the one that has to code whatever someone else told you to build. You have some ground to stand on about that. So
just holler when you're ready. Are you good? Unless you're good. Yeah.
Any suggestions for resources for lack of a better term, developing a better aesthetic sense? I mean, for example, one of the things I found really remarkable about your talk or your slides is you made really effective use of 3 colors. And it worked really well. And if I had designed those slides, it would have been way more complicated. Like, what's a good resource for that kind of thing?
I'm still learning. Like, I would say graphic design is the thing I have the least training. I mean, I have a music degree, so I'm still learning these things too. And my strategy, as with playing jazz, is to copy people that are better than I am. So I will look at someone else's thing and maybe change it a little bit, but over time, through the process of copying, I can learn why did they do it that way. And so doing is one of the best ways. There's also some free sites that have like color palettes where you can choose a collection of colors, like 3 or 4, and they're good combinations. In fact, they have names, and the designers get ranked by most popular palette for the summer. Those are another great way to start with that and use those colors. I also tried to reduce the number of fonts, so there were only 3 different font faces in that whole thing, and 3's already pushing it. To start with as few choices as you can and try to work with that. Usually the problem comes when you start adding bolding, italics, color, sizes. You have too many things going on, and it actually adds noise. So, but it takes time, and I don't have a really quick answer for that, but doing is probably the best way to learn about that, or taking a graphic design course or something like that. So,
Yeah, we think time for questions.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll get to you.
Sort of banking off that, do you think that a flat design is like a fad, or do you think that's something that's going to stick around? Or
I usually don't get too hung up on these things about which. Usually the problems are so much bigger that I'm looking at. It's like, yeah, it's a flat button, but it's like, again, it's on an island that no one's able to get to. You have such bigger problems than whether it's flat or not. Generally speaking, I like minimal design, and this is another point I should have put in the slide, which is the invisible interface. So if you're doing a good job with your product, no one really noticed your interface. That's actually a really good thing. It's just, like, could you remember, like, I know OpenTable is red, and I use it to book stuff, but I couldn't tell you what their interface looks like. I just know that, like, the times are there, and it's easy to find the stuff, and when I want to book a table, I go to OpenTable. I don't really know what it's like. Now, Waze, the driving app, I can tell you what that looks like. That's a great example of non-data ink galore. There is so much friggin' noise on that thing. If you look at the saturation of color, the really heavy colors, big thick lines, these kind of goofy icons and stuff, and then go look at like Google Maps and just look at the street view, pull up the same thing, you'll notice the colors are reduced. You'll notice how much more gray there is in the Google version of that, because every street and every building, all that's noise. Your driving route is the signal that you want to stand out. So if you've got black roads everywhere and then a big purple thing over it, there's a lot of noise to compete with that. So I'm kind of like, whether it's flat or not, I'm kind of like, which one has the strongest signal? I generally like the flat thing. I think the beveling and the skeuomorphism is the technical word for when you have the leather-bound iCal. When you bring real-world concepts into software, the guy actually got booted out of Apple, or there was a big fight about that, and that's why everything went away. He was kind of the evangelist for that. And there was also a general thinking that people finally understand this new medium of tactile text, so we don't need to carry through these physical world metaphors anymore. And so they've kind of gone to more of this minimal interface, which I really like the charts that you saw up there with the red and green dots and the CPU is over. Like, you couldn't really remember what the borders look like or whatever. You just saw the charts and the statistics in the red to tell me that something was wrong. And I mean, I imagine most of you probably don't know what the color was of the label, of the header for that component. It was green on gray background, but you didn't really see it. So that's kind of my thing, is that's not necessarily bad or good, but I do like to reduce, stuff. So my general thing is, I guess I kind of have always been sort of a flat fanatic. I like some gradients here and there can actually help with some things sometimes as well, but don't feel like a button necessarily has to be hugely beveled, but you also need to watch out that it doesn't look like a rectangle that doesn't look like it's clickable. We call that an affordance. So the affordance means like, oh, I know that's a button and it's clickable, or a blue hyperlink. The affordance tells me that there's an interactivity there. So you want to watch out that you're not so minimal that you don't know that there's any interactivity there, because now you have a usability problem. So I don't know if that's answered your question or not, but yeah. Oh wait, no, over here. Is there one? Are you ready, Ford?
Probably one more question.
That's fine.
So my question is, if you do work in an environment where sprints are every week or
Uh-huh.
bi-weekly, what are the most potent activities, UX activities you can conduct to be true to design thinking and yet stay patient?
So usually what I do with Agile is I like to call what's building the runway. And so when I come in, I usually like to do some projects that aren't necessarily going to be part of the Scrum. And you may think, oh, this is waterfall. But the 0 sprint is the design sprint, so to speak. I want to build up a queue of code-ready design work. It's been tested, it's validated, we love the design, and when you guys have time to build it, you can build it. Now, what's probably going to happen is there's going to be problems with the design when you get into the sprint. You're going to say, oh my god, we can't bite all this off, we love it, but it's too much, or whatever. What I usually do then is say, okay, whenever that happens, the designers or me will stop work on our future sprint, because remember, we're now ahead of you. We built a runway up for the engineering. We'll stop work on that. We always come back to the current sprint. That always takes priority. We do some negotiation. Maybe we cut some features out, stuff like that. That's kind of how I usually manage the tight time boxing that comes with that. Agile doesn't allow for a lot of stuff if your company is not doing iteration and actually validating that the design work and revisiting the thing that you shipped out, like, oh, it's good enough, just get it out because we have this next thing coming up. That's a classic sign you're not really doing Agile. You're really just doing waterfall in small increments. Now, it doesn't mean Agile is necessarily bad. Again, I don't care what it's called. I do like agility, so whatever your process is, I like measuring what you're doing and knowing what you're doing and not just shipping out small amounts of stuff constantly and just adding to this pile, because that's called baggage or code spaghetti. As you know, you're now carrying along this huge thing behind you, which means if there's a monumental user experience problem, it's going to be really friggin' expensive to fix it, and no one's going to want to touch that. So by measuring along the way, you de-risk your code, you de-risk the product, but it takes, you know, it's a cultural change that sometimes has to happen if you're used to this, you know, every week code's flying out the door and, you know, oh, we added something, you know. So,
Cool.
are we still
Yeah.
ready to go?
Yeah, we're yeah.
Okay, so here's the mic.
All right.
Cool.
Cool.
Thank you.